Every time we build and ship software, we learn something new. Understanding what worked and what didn't helps us build more confidently the next time around. That's why we're launching the Confident Commit newsletter. We want to help you make better, data-driven decisions. Subscribe today to Win It Software. CircleCI.com/newsletter.
Hello, and welcome to the Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader for all things CI and CD. And today I'm joined by Ken Rose, CTO of OpsLevel. Ken, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to have you.
Hey, Rob, it's great to be on the show. Thank you.
Also, fellow Torontonian, which I think is really important to call out, although you can see behind me, well, probably not that many people are watching, but you can see behind me this Bay Area sky, it's not really the skyline either. Oh, you can see a little bit of the Oakland Bay Bridge over there. So yeah, you can tell that I'm not there anymore, but I always love to give little shout outs to my fellow Canadians. All right, well, let's jump into it. So, we'll get a little bit, I think, of what OpsLevel does here, but to kick things off, my perspective of kind of what you do and why you do it, I think a lot of that ties into a trend that we're seeing in software delivery and software construction around increasing complexity. And we've been trying to deal with that increasing complexity in different ways, like introducing tools to better understand our systems, increasing role of platform teams, trying to handle some of that complexity and take it away from individual software teams. So can you just tell us a little bit about, what your perspective is on that growth of complexity in software, and what it is that leads to folks choosing a tool like OpsLevel, and what it is, the problem that you're trying to solve for those teams?
Yeah, definitely. I think, the problem that we do solve is that complexity in software, right? And when I want to kind of try to define what that complexity looks like, when I think about software development, 20 years ago, the life of what I'm going to call a product developer, right? Those developers that work on that, end user business facing value, it's kind of simple. They're just like, they write code day to day. Like their primary thing to do is just to ship and write code. Not even ship it, just write it. Write the code. Someone else will take care of deploying it. There's an operations team that can productionize it. And then, kind of early 2000s, 2010s, the rise of DevOps, the rise of shift left, the rise of you build it, you own it, right? Tools like CircleCI, right? Where it's like, hey, like developers, you're going to know about your own CI and CD pipelines. That's extra stuff. All these aspects of the SDLC are going to come concentrated on those product developers. There's just more they have to know, right? So in addition to having to know about, the craft of software development around programming languages and frameworks and architecture, they also have to know about software delivery. They have to understand what CI is and how their software is actually built and how artifacts are generated and where those artifacts go. And then they have to understand in an operational environment, what is this thing doing in production? Like how much load does it usually take? What does reliability look like? How to go on call, how to respond to incidents and errors, dealing with major production incidents. So there's just more responsibilities, right? And that's kind of one dimension of complexity that product developers have today. And so platform teams, to your point, have kind of risen. I use the term platform team pretty broadly as this mechanism to help solve some of that complexity, to help solve some of those cross-cutting problems, right? Because you don't want all these product teams, all these product developers have to solve the same problems over and over. You want one team in the organization to say, hey, how are we going to do CI? We'll pick CircleCI as our vendor. Great, that's it. And every single product team can just kind of standardize and consolidate on one tool. And again, I mentioned this idea of platform teams and being a very broad term. I think of the word platform team, meaning this team that is sort of internally focused, right? As a team that should act as a product delivery team. They should be building a product that helps other product developers, other product development teams in their organization. And sometimes that team isn't called the platform team. It can be called, I hate this name, but the DevOps team. It can be called the TechOps team. Sometimes it'll be particular slice, it'll be like, we're the security group or we're the reliability team, but it's all with the same focus on like, hey, we're here to solve some problem that we know is going to affect a large swath of users being other developers in the company.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, just the list of things that people have to, like, I was getting exhausted, just like, yes, that's so true. Like everything just stacks and stacks and stacks. But a key takeaway in there for me is that, treating the product teams, if we want to call them that, as the customer, right? Yeah. Like the platform team in whatever variant of that, like really understanding what the needs of that team are and how to support them and help them do their job better. You know, as you were describing that evolution and just like, again, stacking on this responsibility, that responsibility, I do think one of the major transitions that got us there was, you know, shifting away from monoliths to microservices. And I know lots of people have lots of opinions, but one facet of that is when you showed up and just wrote code exactly as you're describing, a lot of the fundamental sort of interactions with the outside world had already been implemented, right? So for most folks, it's like, I don't worry about how I'm talking to the database or the reliability behind that. I'm just implementing business logic. I focus on business logic, business logic, business logic. And in many microservice environments, folks are showing up and saying, okay, first I have to figure out, like, how do I start up? How do I report errors? How do I connect to the database? How do I store stuff? How do I, like, what's my HTTP stack? Just stuff that's done. And I think platform teams are also focusing on solving some of those problems, but like so much of the fundamentals kind of fresh regularly in those environments. So we've solved a set of problems, introduced a different set of problems, I think, which is like the great trade-off in engineering. So as all of that complexity builds, you know, you bring in a platform team, et cetera. But like, as you hone in on the specific problem of ops level developer, developer portal.
Developer portal,
yeah. What is the piece of that you're sort of most, I guess, of the complexity that you're most interested in trying to solve for that customer that is the product?
Yeah, definitely. So I kind of want to take it back to that, thinking about platform teams through a product development mindset, right? So if you think about, like, what is the product then that a platform team would create, right? And so, you know, you can think about, well, maybe AWS would be like the perfect kind of portal, right? It's like, hey, here's all this platform and tooling and infrastructure. But that kind of alone is enough. It's really broad. There's no, and I'm not going to pick on AWS specific hyperscaler, but like, you know, there's a whole smattering of offerings. There's no guidance on what tools should be used or how they should be set up, right? Because AWS is, you know, and all the hyperscalers are fairly versatile. So there has to be some product that can abstract away a lot of the concepts around, well, networking and operating systems and Kubernetes, building some kind of internal platform that helps alleviate all that, right? To the point you made, Rob, around, you know, what's the HTTP timeout and the back off and the retry semantic, like all that should be kind of provided as a library or as a platform or as something that product developers can go and take. In addition, there needs to be some kind of like self-service developer experience built on top of that application platform. So the developers who want to spin up a new service or restart their CI/CD pipeline or make an API request or connect to a new API, they have this consolidated place that has their APIs, their tools, their services, their documentation, their best practices and their patterns for how to assemble all this software together, arranged in some compelling product offering, right? And what that allows is those product teams to move faster. Instead of trying to hunt down information or hunt down context, you've invested in an application platform and this portal that can sit on top that consolidates all this information about what are your services, what are your teams, how is it built, where is the documentation for it, where are the tools, how can I get access to the underlying platform if I need to do something to increase our load or scale our cluster. It's the kind of UI that sits on top of this underlying platform. And that's what I think of as an internal development portal, right? Is this self-service place that allows for developers to, across different product teams, to coordinate and collaborate better together.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think, you know, as it's not just services that have, the monolith is broken apart into services, but we've changed the way we think about organizations as a result, like tying architectural to organizational structure, like it's not novel. And so creating the environment in which folks can, you know, maintain their autonomy. I'm always a little nervous about how people actually use that word, but, you know, be able to self-serve, I think is really the right, by understanding these are the pieces that I'm dependent on. This is how I can understand the system without, like, now I need to figure out what team owns this thing and go find them and have a conversation, sort of interrupt them. So I think that model makes a ton of sense. Shifting a little bit, I'm curious how you're experiencing the current environment. And what I mean specifically is macroeconomic environment, in that I think a lot of engineering organizations have gone through rapid growth and then some, we'll call it acute shrinkage, right? Over the course of, like, we've seen tons of turmoil in the industry, lots of shrinking organizations, kind of resetting size and stuff like that. And growth, and speaking again of team autonomy and distributing work, drove a lot of probably complexity in terms of, we have more services because we have more teams or whatever. And then organizations shrink. And it feels like now folks are probably scrambling to manage all of that with a smaller team. And maybe then, this is exactly in the wheelhouse of what you're doing, is like, how do we surface all of this in a way that we can get our heads around it and try to manage this with a smaller team? Like, is that having direct impact on how people are thinking about using ops level, the number of people that are using? Like, are you seeing that trend overall, I guess?
I think a trend that we're definitely seeing is teams having to do more with less, right? That there's this idea that like, hey, we still have the same growth targets that we had year over year, but we now have to be more efficient as a business, right? And that's a message that, we've heard from our customers, a message we have internally at ops level as well. I think that the way to get there, though, is through investment and through leverage in your engineering organization, right? It's how do you make your teams ship more value kind of per unit time, right? Well, you can ask the question, okay, well, if they're not shipping value, what are they doing, right? And if they're doing other mundane background stuff that is toil, how can you reduce that or eliminate that, right? And that becomes the investment that you then have to make. You also, Rob, I think you brought up a great point that, you're right that I think one way that you can get this explosion of services is just, hey, it's ZIRP, we have all these engineers, we have all this stuff building, we have all these services that are exploding. Great. If you've laid off some people, or you have a smaller team, first of all, that software, you're right, hasn't gone away. Like, you still have an ownership challenge. You still have to either make an explicit decision. Are you going to sunset that software? Or if it's serving a business need in production, there needs to be a team that owns it, because otherwise you're going to have some risk in terms of your organization. Like, what happens when that things go down? What if that becomes a vector for security breach, right? What happens if you're not applying your best practices to that software? So that idea of like having a catalog that inventories everything, and a service catalog is kind of part of it, an internal developer portal, becomes a really important aspect. But there are other areas beyond just ZIRP and lots of money and lots of engineers that leads to complexity, right? We have organizations that have grown through acquisition. And I think what you're seeing now also in this time of kind of cash crunch is for companies that are shrinking, some of them are also getting acquired. And that acquiring organization now has a heterogeneous production environment, right? They have, here's their software, and then they have this new group of software, and they have to figure out how they're going to integrate that. And we have some customers that their entire growth journey has been through M&A. And so if you're in an organization like that, it's like, how do you start to consolidate like 17 different, we have one, we had a call this morning, right? We have 17 different like credit card authentication gateways, like 17. Like, I can't imagine how, if you're an engineer in that organization, like, okay, I have to go interface with credit card authorization. Which one? Like, and how do we decide which one's the right one? So there's a lot of effort to consolidate, and that consolidation helps. And it might not be consolidating down to one, right? It might be, let's go from 17 to 3. So at least, because maybe there's pros and cons for them, but there is some subset that like, there's just less complexity that's there. And so again, that fundamental problem of like reducing complexity is the one that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's the M&A notion is a really fascinating one that I think we forget. And by we, I think in industry, we think of systems as just being built from a blank slate and built up. And we, how did we make this decision? This doesn't make any sense. How did we choose 17 credit card providers or whatever? Like, that's real, right? As organizations get larger, they get more complex, and it's not just a result of people not talking to each other. It's this, mashing together. Like, absolutely, large acquisitions in particular, we're doing this because we're getting customer base. It's accretive to the business, but it's not necessarily that simple from a technical perspective. All I could think about as you were describing that was, somebody please put a gateway in front that abstracts away from everyone else which credit card provider is being, used, so that someone can clean that up without everyone else having to make the changes. And I think we often end up with these things sort of stitched directly together. But there's a particularly under time crunch, right? Like, we need to acquire this business, but it needs to be live in 3 weeks or something, because we gotta drive revenue and demonstrate that it was again accretive to the business, et cetera, et cetera. And later we'll clean it up. Right.
And
But
then
more
later,
things get
yeah,
glued together
that's just it,
and whatever.
yeah.
So just putting little boundaries in place is a thing that I always obsess over. Like, how can we make it so that you can make that change without anyone else having to know about it? Like insulate everyone else from that change.
But I think that requires also that you've decided as an organization, hey, we're going to start to make the investment to strangle this out, right? Like put the gateway in front of it. That way it's abstracted. But then you just have to say, okay, but like what are the, and I don't know enough about credit card authentication gateways to talk intelligently here, but
Me neither. So we could just make it up.
But yeah, there's some service, like, but what's the functionality of that? Like is it that there's 100% overlap in functionality and capability of all these different services? Like because whenever I think of gateway, it's like, well, what's the lowest common denominator functionality that we meaningfully have to support? Like, does this thing do this one? Does it have this one extra function that's really important? Does it, I don't know, auth the token using some cool HMAC, or I don't know, right? And then that becomes a question of like, how do you put that in the gateway? So the gateway is almost like, yeah, that's the first step of like, whether you're trying to have one so that you can get it away in the future, or you're trying to get rid of 17. But it requires, to that point that you made, that investment to say like, yeah, hey, we're going to bring on this company. We're going to do it as quickly as possible. We need a plan for how we're going to consolidate this stuff in the future. And sometimes that's tomorrow's problem. Like let's focus on the business, the growth, the customer base, right? The technology we'll come back to. Like, let's just let's keep the lights on. Let's keep things working as they were. And we'll worry about integrating the team over the year.
Right. Well, I mean, there's M&A is a fantastic own subject in terms of like team dynamics and all these other things. I think that that exact point though about the cost of the investment, right? Choosing to make an investment. I think for me, cost of delay is a great mental framework of thinking about that. Like, yes, it costs something now, but what does it cost when we do it in the future, kind of thing? Like, it's, if we integrate all these different systems together and then we have to unwind it all, like we know that's not going to happen. Right. But it means the cost of change anywhere starts to increase. Right. And we talk about earlier, you were referencing, doing more with less, which I know is like a hot button for folks. Like the reality is we want to figure out how to continue to deliver in a sustainable manner, but be delivering more value because, to your point, we've created leverage, we've taken out the toil, whatever. And when I'm trying to work my way through 17 different integrations every time I try to change something, like I assure you that is going to be slower than if we had invested up front to say, let's isolate any, this complexity of this system away from others.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of what I'm talking about when I say we're seeing this shift now where folks are like, wow, we used to solve this problem by just hiring more engineers because like money was basically free. Yeah. And now we have to do the real work. Like now we have to do the hard work, but we don't even have all those engineers anymore. It's like a very difficult transition to go through. And I'm a little hopeful, let's say, that, I've been in this long enough to have been through a couple of these bumps, but that memory fades, right? And we sort of get back into it. So I'm hopeful that if we take anything away from this time, people will be like, you know what? Some discipline around how we build things actually would have been really valuable in this moment. So maybe let's it's a lot, I guess it's a lot easier to pay for when you do it in increments, right? Because now we're all scrambling to like simplify our systems in a way without all the folks that we used to have. So
definitely. I was thinking what you just said, that it's like doing more with less is a hot button issue. And I don't think it should be, right? Like, I think if you interpret it literally as like, okay, we were doing this much work before, and now we're going to do the same amount of work with like half the team. I'm going to pick half. Like that means everyone has to do twice as much work. Okay, that's not fair, right? And that maybe makes it hot button. Like, well, why do I have all this extra workload now? Why didn't we as an organization figure it out? Right? Money's not free, all that. But I think it's an offer towards efficiency. And I think that is, look, I'm a founder. I run a business. I care a lot about efficiency, right? I care a lot about like, hey, how do we ship faster? That doesn't mean how do I burden more of our employees and make them like do more, hours in the day or just do more work. But how can I like increase the leverage that we have? How can I make sure that for every hour of work, we're getting like the fullest hour of or the maximum amount of output from that hour, right? So what investments do we have to make as an organization? And I think it's almost an invitation then to say like, well, what are those investments that we want to make, right? How do we reduce the amount of toil? How do we take away the number of production instances that we have? How do we speed up our CI and CD pipelines? How do we reduce our error rate? How do we make our developers like kind of write code faster, review faster? How can we make documentation available, right? More simply so that people aren't like less scrambling. How how do we keep developers in their flow state? How do we maximize the amount of flow state that we have? And that's a very different conversation than just like, okay, I'm going to burn work. So whenever I hear of like, let's try to do more with less, I look at it as like, that's great. Like as an engineer, like, I don't know, I like making code faster. I like making things more efficient. Like it's the same thing, just apply to our processes.
Absolutely. I think you're exactly on point with that. Like, brought up flow state, which I'm a huge fan of. Like the thing that I love about software engineering, which I do very little of at this point, is that feeling, right? That feeling of being super productive, generating something that I think is really valuable to my, to my business, to my customer, and sort of locking in on delivering. And every single one of those speed bumps, that's like, oh, now I need to go find the person that owns this because it doesn't make any sense and it doesn't behave the way that I expected it to behave, is exhausting to me by comparison with like delivering value.
Right.
And I think it's, I guess the thing that I would call out about being a hot button issue is it's on leaders, not on individuals, to both identify and follow through on delivering what you just described. Like, let's go figure out what's getting in the way and let's stamp it out, right? But not, hey, you need to go be faster. Like, come talk to me about what's getting in your way because it's probably my fault, right? It's probably something I did, and I've been at Circle CI almost 10 years. It probably has something to do with me, right? Speaking for my own organization, like, let me help you figure out how to drive through that, not just like go be more efficient. And I think that it's not everyone hears that. Like it's a challenging time for everybody, right?
Definitely.
Like downturns are not as fun as rocket ships, right? I mean, as far as the economy goes. And so it really is, I would make that call out to leaders. Like, if you're listening to this, invest your time and energy in really helping. And as a CTO, I'm sure, as someone who does both software engineering and leadership, like, you're in a fantastic position to guide folks through that, right? It's not just like, oh, it's like, I hear that you need to be more efficient. It's like, one, I love being efficient as a software developer, meaning delivering, being in flow, focusing on value, all those things, because that's exciting to me. Much more exciting than writing tickets and asking other people to do things. Right. And then two, as a leader, like, I have the ability to just say, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. That's not necessary. We're going to fix the process and do it this way and make things faster. So I do think it really is on leaders to help people through that, to drive through it. But it's so rewarding. It's just so fun to deliver, like, effectively. Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, because the dopamine hit is when you ship it, and whatever big initiative you're pushing towards, and you get it out the door. And what's the Mr. T expression? Like, I love it when a plan comes together. Like, it's like, yeah, we set a plan and we execute on it and we shipped it. Like, that's incredible. Like, that's, yeah.
I feel like I'm splitting hairs on a TV show that nobody watched, but I think it was one of the other characters.
Okay,
I can't even remember all their names.
It wasn't necessarily you. You are right. I forgot the guy, but it was the boss guy.
What's that?
A-Team. That was it. It was the A-Team.
Yeah. I never saw the film, but I did watch the show growing up. This is a lot of benchmarking.
I think I'm dating myself with that reference also.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was worried about. Anyway, cool. So let's get back to complexity for just a minute as we start to wind things down. Like, I think we've covered a lot of this, but we talked about increasing complexity, talked about trying to help people understand and manage complexity. But I guess as we work through this, as we try to drive to leverage, does it feel like all the complexity that we have today is necessary, or have we accepted some level of incidental complexity, and are we now in a position where we need to do something about that? Or are we better off sort of driving through, and like, is there a different perspective of focusing on value that doesn't involve sort of reducing some of this complexity in your mind?
Yeah. Okay. So is the complexity necessary? Like, no, right? Like, that's why it's kind of there. Look, if I think about an organization that has 17 credit card processes, is that necessary? No, of course it's not. Like, in fact, they should try to consolidate down to one. Is the complexity of having, an organization that didn't go through M&A, but just happened to go through kind of Brex, I'll pick, right? Kind of classic hypergrowth, tons of services. Is all the complexity they have in their production architecture necessary? I've never seen the architecture, but I can probably say, like, it's probably not all necessary, right? Mm-hmm. It exists, I think, just as a function of lack of context over time. Like with the benefit of hindsight, if I look back on our architecture and any architecture, well, I have all the context of right now that I can look back and say like, well, I would change this, I would do this, I do this, because I know things now that maybe I didn't know then, right? It's like when I hear the things that developers will talk about around like, hey, what would you change in your architecture if you could? It's like, well, like we have this one service and we thought it was going to do this thing, but it no longer does that thing, or that customer churned, or it's still serving some percentage of traffic, but we have this other thing that we're moving towards, right? But we need to keep this for compliance reasons. Like there's all sorts of we built this thing in-house, and now there's this technology that kind of replaces it, and we're migrating to that, but that technology didn't exist when we first built it. So there's all kinds of reasons that complexity exists, but it's always around like, it was probably the best decision at the time. Mm-hmm. Right. And then as kind of time moves on, you can look back and say, well, now we have new information or new context, and we wouldn't make the same decision today. So that complexity is no longer necessary, but it's there, it's happened, it's baked in. And we then have to make the decision, okay, can we live with this? Can we sustain this? Right. Can we sustain this duplication of functionality? Can we sustain this thing, this maintenance burden that's now been replaced by this fancy new SaaS tool? Or should we invest in trying to migrate or sunset it, right? And that's always that's always the trade-off that engineering leaders have to make. Is like, what are the areas that we want to invest in to help really, maximize the return we're going to get, minimize the amount of toil that our developers are going to face. So I think it's somewhat necessary, but we have to decide intentionally when we want to remove it. Right.
Well, I would even take away from that, which I think is an interesting perspective. It doesn't matter. It's there.
Kind of, yeah.
Like, yeah. Are we happy that it got there? No, but the question is not like, cool. We could retro and say, what did we learn? Is there something we could do differently as we think about the next step? And to your point, which of these items would be valuable for us to change right now? But we are where we are. We have the system that we have. What is the best path from here to where we want to be in terms of like investing in our next capabilities, investing in changing underlying systems so that we can more rapidly invest, right? That's like classic, like, I think we love to say, well, everything will be faster if we just do this one thing. It's like, how much faster and when? Nobody knows the answer to that question, right? So then it always ends up being, well, okay, well, that doesn't sound particularly compelling, but you add enough of those up and, you can't even move anymore. So again, that's your exactly point, landing on leaders to help the organization think about which of these things will be most impactful to us, which of these things should we focus on? And I would say, in the spirit of minimizing WIP, pick one.
Yep.
Fix that thing, not pick 20 and everybody work on something different, trying to fix their thing that bothers them. And then none of them actually get fixed because there wasn't enough capacity to actually get it to the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sequencing those is super important, right? Because otherwise it's also more scientific in a sense. It's like, there is somewhat of an imperfect measurement here when I'll give you an example, right? So imagine instituting game days in an organization, right? So kind of like controlled failure experiments in your production environment to help reduce incidents and, spread knowledge around how to respond to incidents. If you do that alongside like 20 different other things, like you don't really know if you're going to get, like, you might have some output at the end, but like, how do you kind of measure it? And it's not even clear if you do that, like how much, did you really reduce the number of incidents? How do you kind of know that? You kind of don't, because you don't really have a prior that you can establish a baseline against, but you do it kind of knowing it should be helpful, right? Like, because if you don't do it, you'll continue to have incidents. You might have more and more incidents. And then, I don't know, you'll spend all your time responding to incidents and not necessarily like training and enabling your engineers to respond better, to spread architectural patterns, to kind of shake the tree of your architecture and see where there's low-hanging fruit of like config values that should be changed. And I think, and I'm picking here on chaos experiments, but I think for all these engineering investments, right? Consolidating CI and CD. We have one customer, again, they one of they're a giant organization, but one subset has a deployment practice of like, they build an artifact, they SFTP it up, somebody then logs into the server and reboots it, right? I'm like, oh man, I remember doing that in like 2002. And it's not to shame them, right? It's like, they built it that way. It kind of works, they haven't decided to pull the trigger to invest. But if they did, man, like automation alone would save them, hours per week, right? It's about, being able to say like, let's pick one and do it. And then we can start to measure the impact. And if we continually do that successively and continually try to remove that toil, we're going to be moving faster.
Right. It's the 1% better every day. Like that's
exactly.
Stack that up and it adds up to
that accumulation is powerful.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I love that as a closing thought. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks everyone for listening. If you like what you hear, you want us to talk to someone particular, hit us up on Twitter at CircleCI. And of course, subscribe on your podcast provider of choice. Share with all your friends, tell the world, help us spread the word on delivering great software. Ken, thanks again for joining me. It's been awesome to have you. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Rob.